Well, thank you, Steve, for those kind words. Hello, everybody. It is fantastic to see so many people here. Thank you very, very much for coming. I know some people have travelled quite a long way, and I really appreciate that, so thanks very much for them too. Now, as Steve mentioned, I use mathematics to understand ecological issues. And this is something I've been doing for around 20 years now. And so this has ranged on different projects, and there's been some large-scale projects that Steve mentioned, like looking at how climate change might affect the world's vegetation. And there's been some small-scale projects, such as trying to understand how viruses might evolve and become more virulent. But the key thing about all the work I do is that I do it with collaborators, and I have worked with some brilliant and very interesting people on all these projects. And so the first thing I want to do is just thank all these fabulous people for the help they've given me over my research career to date. And so, as I'm sure you're all aware, today I'm going to talk about one particular ecological system. It's an ecological system for which I'm perhaps most associated. And if you've walked around the university and seen how many posters there are that have been advertising this talk, they have done nothing to dispel this association. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the plight of the red squirrel in the British Isles. And I'm going to start right at the beginning. So I'm going to start by explaining something about the species and then the history, and move on from there and intertwine that with how mathematics has been used to help understand how to conserve this species. So let's begin. Let's begin by introducing the species. And I am incredibly lucky because I have been lent, under here, my little magic trick, I've been lent by Tony Weir a fabulous little example of a red squirrel. So this is the species of interest that we'll be looking at today. Now I'm going to leave that there to enjoy the talk as well. And I'm going to give you a bit more detail about this species. So this is the Eurasian red squirrel. It is the only native squirrel species in the British Isles. It belongs to the genus Squirrels, and I wanted to tell you that just because there's a nice, interesting fact about it. Squirrels comes from the Greek skia, meaning shadow, and ura, meaning tail, and it means one who sits in the shadow of one's own tail. And that's a beautiful example of someone sitting in the shadow of one's own tail there in that picture. So that's the species I'm going to talk about. It's native to the British Isles, but it actually wasn't always in the British Isles, which seemed a bit of a contradiction. So when did it arrive here? Well, let's go back in time a bit. Let's go back 10,000 years. So 10,000 years ago, the ice sheets were retreating, but sea levels were much lower. And so there were land links between mainland Europe and the British Isles. And so it's across those land links that the red squirrels dispersed. So they dispersed from refuges in mainland Europe into the British Isles, and there they would have become abundant in any suitable forests they could find. So in a similar way, the red squirrel dispersed northwards through Europe and through Asia, and if you look, it has quite a wide distribution. It goes from the Atlantic coast here in Ireland in the west, out to northern Japan and eastern Russia in the east. So it's got a wide distribution. But it's been here now for a long time, hence it's thought of as native to the UK. Not only that, it's a very popular species. So the red squirrel is very much embedded in our culture. It features in children's stories, such as the tale of Squirrel Nutkin. Rather worryingly, it used to teach us how to cross the road. Rather worryingly, because Tony's squirrel there is actually roadkill, and I think we can be sure that's not Tufty as part of the Tufty Curb Club there. So it's popular. It's voted the second most popular species in Scotland. I thought the first was the haggis, but I looked into it, and it in fact was the golden eagle. And so it's a very valuable asset for the tourist industry, and as you can see, it's very good for revenues in tourist gift shops. And there's some of the gifts I've received since I've been researching into squirrels. So we like it, that's the point. But there's a problem. Red squirrel numbers are declining, they've been declining for some time, and now the red squirrel is in fact protected and it is a priority of the UK government to protect remaining red squirrel populations. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this decline. Then I'm going to talk about what are the mechanisms which cause this decline, and how did mathematics help understand what these mechanisms are. Then we're going to look at what the conservation strategies are to try and protect the remaining red populations. And mathematics is being used at this point in time to help shape these conservation strategies. So that's the way the talk's going to go. And so let's have a look at the history of the red squirrel in the British Isles. So, to be honest, the records from 8000 BC to 1400 are a little bit sketchy. So there isn't a great deal of detail there. But then in the 15th and 16th century, there was dramatic reductions in red squirrels, and that was because of deforestation, because of agriculture. In fact, the reductions in Scotland were so great that it led to an Act of Parliament note. Now, I've been told not to do this, but I'm going to do this in a Scottish accent. The Gren Wood of Scotland is utterly destroyed. And that means that, oops, thank you. That means, sorry, I got myself too excited. The forests in Scotland were very much destroyed. And when there's a lack of forest, there's a lack of squirrels. So red squirrels continue to suffer in the 18th century and for much of the 19th century because forests were still being removed, and it almost led to the extinction of red squirrels in Scotland. But by the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, reds started to benefit from extensive planting of woodlands, and so their numbers increased. And their numbers increased to such high levels that they in fact started to become a pest species. So here's an authentic picture from 1900 showing exactly how many reds there might have been at that time. So there was a lot of them, and so much so that they formed squirrel clubs with the aim of hunting and removing reds to control their numbers. They then started to suffer again, and again for a similar reason, a loss of woodlands in the early 20th century. This time, loss of woodlands to support the war effort. And red control ceased in 1927. So, we've seen that their numbers can increase and decrease. It very much seems to be linked to woodland habitat. So at that point, there's probably no reason for not thinking that the red numbers would increase again if the woodland habitat also improved again. And that may explain how within the 19th century, a new competitor managed to be introduced and managed to invade without really being noticed at first. So what's that new competitor? Well, here it is. It's the North American eastern grey squirrel, the grey squirrel as we call it. It was introduced to England initially from the USA in the 19th century. It was also introduced to Italy, South Africa, Australia and Canada. And it was initially just a pet species, so it would have been kept in enclosures and to be looked at like other enclosed species. But then in the 19th century, someone had the bright idea to release some grey squirrels into the wild. That someone is a Mr. Thomas Brocklehurst. He released a pair of grey squirrels in Henbury Park in Cheshire in 1876. So now we have squirrels in the wild. That introduction was followed by many more. This table here catalogues where some of the early releases of grey squirrels occurred. So some of these releases were from individuals brought over from America. Some were from populations where they'd been released earlier and which were thriving. There was a thriving population in Woburn, and that led to lots of introductions. There was an introduction in Edinburgh here in 1919. So the grey squirrel had been introduced. Why? We're not sure. It was perhaps just part of this Victorian ideal of reshaping the world. It was a fashionable thing to do at the time. And certainly at the time, there was no idea that red squirrels would be under threat or that the grey squirrel might harm other native species. And an example of that comes from a respected naturalist at the time who said the grey squirrel can never become widespread and dominant like our other introduced animals, the rabbit and the brown rat. So there was no perception of a problem at that time. However, the greys did spread and they expanded quite rapidly. So this map here shows the initial introductions in the orange colour, how far greys had expanded by the 1930s. And in the 1930s, they started to be considered a pest. They were noticeably abundant and they were causing noticeable damage. Greys have a habit of stripping bark off trees, and that leads to tree death. It even managed to infuriate readers of the Times, and they requested information as to the most efficacious method of ridding the country of one of the most mischievous and voracious pests. Now, not wanting to ignore what readers of the Times do, a year later the government introduced the Grey Squirrel Order, which legalised the control of greys. In 1947, squirrel clubs which had been formed were given free ammunition. I have a feeling there might have been a bit of spare ammunition at that time, which helped. A few years later, a bounty scheme was introduced which offered 5 shillings for each grey squirrel tail. And by 1957, over 1 million grey squirrels had been removed. Sadly, it was making very little difference. And if we look further on in time, we can see that the grey squirrels continue to expand their distribution and range. So here the grey picture represents how the greys are expanding. The reds is where reds remain, and the orange is where there's still both species present. And what we can see is that throughout most of England and Wales, it's dominated by grey squirrels. This is relatively the present day situation. Reds now only really remain in Highland Scotland and in Western Ireland, and in isolated and largely protected regions in southern Scotland, in Wales, and in England. Okay, so there's a lot less of them. So at this point, and in fact in around the 1970s, we got an understanding that greys were expanding, and it coincided with the replacements of reds. So we'd triggered that the two things were related. But it hadn't really triggered why. And so the question changed from what's happening to why it's happening. So there's a need to understand now why greys are being replaced by reds. So this is where the science starts to begin. And one of the first things that was proposed was, is it simply that greys outcompete reds? Well, greys are certainly bigger and heavier, so just do they actively fight and chase reds away? Or are greys just better at acquiring food and breeding sites, and that's leading to the decline of the red squirrel? Well, we're going to look at these two bits and see what we think. So first, aggressive behaviour. Okay, do greys actively fight with and outcompete the reds? Well, there's not really any evidence for that. In fact, if there is any evidence, there's more evidence for aggressive behaviour within species, red versus red or grey versus grey, than there is within, between species. There's very little aggressive behaviour from greys to reds. If anything, there's a tolerance or just a complete indifference when the two species are there together. And there's lots of evidence that sees them feeding amicably in the same habitat. So aggressive behaviour does not seem to be a factor in the decline. So what about competition for resources? Well, certainly grey squirrels steal red's food. Okay, that definitely happens. And so what could that mean? Well, there's evidence from field work that when greys are present, reds have lower female body mass, and they also produce fewer young per litter. And not only that, when greys are present, instead of reds having 2 litters per year, they only have 1 litter per year. So greys certainly seem to be affecting the reproductive ability of reds. So there's a factor. There's a factor that we'd like to understand and like to see if that's the cause of the decline of red squirrels. So this came from field studies, and field studies are superb at suggesting potential mechanisms, in this case, which could lead to red replacement. But then is it the full picture? Is it the main driver? Well, that's where mathematical models come in. Mathematical models are excellent tools at testing whether particular mechanisms are potentially the key factors in the population dynamics of a species. And in particular, mathematical models can extrapolate the findings that we get on a local level from field studies and have a look at the big picture, the general findings. Is this the main cause? And that's what we're going to do. There's in fact been several studies which have used mathematics to try and understand the competition between reds and greys. They use similar methods and they reach similar conclusions. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of the work I did with some collaborators, Mike Boots and Dan Tompkins, about 10 years ago. And I'm not going to talk much about the maths, so don't panic. In fact, this is what I call my first mathematical model, and I've just written it in words to show you exactly how simple mathematical models are. It just says that the change in the number of reds equals the rate that they reproduce minus the rate at which they die. That's the same for every species in the world, okay? That's what it is. Similarly for greys. The difference is the field studies showed that reproduction is affected by the presence of the other species. So we want a term which limits the reproduction of reds when greys are around, and that's what the model will do. Similarly, actually, the presence of reds does slightly limit the reproduction of greys because they share a resource. It's just that the effect of greys on reds is much greater than the effect of reds on greys. So that's the model in words, that's the model in terms of equations. It's exactly the same thing. Change in number of reds, reproduction, death. It's the same thing, just with equations. That's all I want to say, really, about the mathematical model. What I do want to do is show you what the use of mathematical models is. So we can do experiments with them. It's easy. You only have to press a button. You can get the answers in 20 seconds. You don't have to go out into the field for a year. You can do things really quickly. So here's the experiment we can do in a mathematical model. We can imagine that we've got red squirrels in the absence of greys. So they reach a nice steady density. They're quite happy there. And then we could introduce some grey squirrels and we can see what happens in the model. And so what happens is the density of greys increase, and as that happens, the density of reds decrease. And the reds go to zero density in about 18 years from the introduction of greys. So there's some evidence that competition for resources can lead to the replacement of red squirrels. It's some evidence, but it doesn't necessarily tell us if it's the primary driver or not. To understand that, we have to really then compare back to data. And so possibly the best data we have on this system is from a study by Jonathan Reynolds, which was reported in 1985. And what he did was look at the presence or absence of red and grey squirrels in 5-kilometre grid squares in Norfolk, which is here, which way have I gone? In Norfolk, which is here, in East Anglia. So here's what he has. This is Norfolk, this map here. The black dots represent where red squirrels are present in a 5-kilometre grid square. You walk to a bit of forest, if you see a red squirrel, it's present. It gets a black dot. Okay? By 1981, these open circles represent where grey squirrels are present, and then there's a few circles with both colours. That's where both reds and greys were observed. And so what happened in Norfolk is that greys invaded. They invaded from the south here and from the west around here. And over a 20-year period, they largely replaced the reds in Norfolk. And so we can represent this in this time series plot here. This just shows the number of grid squares that were occupied by reds initially. That goes down to close to zero over that 20-year period, whereas the number occupied by reds increases over that period. That's some data, and we can compare our model to that data. And so this is the comparison. This is how the model compared. So there's the data again. That's from the field. This is the model. It's not brilliant, okay? So there's a problem. The greys increase at about the right rate, but the reds don't decrease at the same sort of rate that we see in the model. If we ran the model for another 20-odd years, this line would come down and eventually the reds would be replaced. So competition between reds and greys can lead to replacement, but the timescale doesn't seem to match the data. And so it might be part of the picture, but it doesn't seem to be the whole picture. And so is there another factor in addition to competition? Well, yes, there is. And the other factor is disease. So this is squirrelpox. I'm sure lots of people have heard of squirrelpox now, but it was only really talked about around 10 years ago. And so this is why. Squirrelpox is a disease. It's carried by greys. Greys can become infected, but it does hardly any damage to greys. You wouldn't really notice when a grey squirrel was infected. And then they recover from the disease and become immune. They show antibodies to the disease. It's different for the reds. It's the same disease. It can infect red squirrels. When it does, they get these horrible sores and legions, and red squirrels die in about 2 weeks. So it's fatal for reds. Very few cases of reds surviving once they become infected. So this disease could be part of the picture here. They think it was introduced with the grey squirrels then when they came over from the USA. But the first actual reported outbreak of squirrelpox was in 1973. By 1996, it was recognised that squirrelpox was spreading with greys, and so it started to be suggested as a potential mechanism which might also be responsible for red replacement. And then in 2002, this was the first time that squirrelpox was actually found to be a shared disease, that it was the same disease that infected greys and didn't cause any damage that could infect reds and which caused this high mortality. So it was only just over 10 years ago that we knew that. And so at that time, we thought, well, we can include this in the model. We can include the effects of disease as well. And so we did. And so this is the model, and I don't want to go and labour this too much, other than when you have reds, you now have to consider two lots of reds. You have to consider healthy red squirrels and infected red squirrels. And healthy red squirrels can still reproduce and die as they always did, but they can also become infected, and when they do, they become an infected squirrel, which has a very high rate of death. Whereas for grey squirrels, they can reproduce and die, they can become infected, but they recover and then are immune to the disease. So that's the mathematical model in words. That's the mathematical model in equations again, but we'll just focus on the same experiment we did last time. And that experiment was to allow reds to be at a density in the absence of grey squirrels, and then introduce some grey squirrels and see what happens. But this time we introduce infected greys rather than uninfected ones. And what happens is you get a big crash in the population, and this little spike here represents some infected reds, and then another crash later on, and the key thing is the replacement now only takes 6 years. So the disease has speeded up the replacement time. And so we can then use that and we can compare it to data again. So here we are. Here we are. So here's the observed data again. Here's the model which includes competition and disease. It's a much better fit. In particular, the red numbers now decrease much more rapidly, and we understand why. We understand it's because the disease effect, which is leading to a much more rapid replacement of greys, and therefore the greys are replaced more quickly. So this was published in 2003, and this bit of mathematical work, along with some further field studies which took place in 2006, which showed that the disease was present in the grey populations where they had replaced reds in England and Wales, it led to the disease unequivocally being linked to the replacement of reds. So it's relatively recent. It's not even 10 years ago that we really fully understood that the main drivers of red replacement was competition and disease acting together. Okay, so now we understand what has been happening. We know that competition and disease are important, so how are we going to go about protecting the reds that we've got left with this new information? So I'm going to jump back in time a bit, and we're going to look at the conservation efforts and how they were shaped by learning this information over time. And we're going to start with the conservation red squirrels in England, because it's a slightly different situation to the conservation of red squirrels in Scotland. So, as I've mentioned before, 1937 Grey Squirrel Control Order allows you to go and hunt grey squirrels and provides you with the ammunition to do it. But really, that was completely uncoordinated. Lots of the time it was taking place in areas where greys had long since been replaced. It was really just a harvesting of greys. There was not really any coordinated effort. It didn't have a very good response. It wasn't really very effective. It wasn't until the 1990s that a coordinated response really started to happen. And it started off with some surveying of grey squirrels, find out where they are, where they might be threatening reds, and then to try and control greys in those regions to protect reds. As we go through time, this becomes more and more coordinated. 1995, the Spade Adam Forest in Kielder, so this is the Kielder Forest region here, so Spade Adam is a forest in there. It became the first red squirrel reserve. And what they did was prevent greys from entering the Spade Adam Forest. Now this is a forestry controlled region. Forestry controlled regions are generally commercial forests. They're going to cut down that forest at some point. So they needed a larger reserve for the reds to be able to disperse into at the point when they have to fell the forest. And so 2003, the whole of Kielder became a red squirrel reserve. And the Forestry Commission really did set the scene here in ways to start protecting reds. And by 2006, there were 16 designated red squirrel strongholds that have been in existence still since then, and red squirrels still survive in all of these strongholds to date. And so some people were telling me they've seen reds in Cumbria. Yes, you will. That's one of our stronghold regions. You'll definitely see reds in Kielder. And if you ever go to Formby in Merseyside, there's nice red populations there too. So that's what's happening in England. But there's a bit of a problem. And the problem is these strongholds are all surrounded by healthy grey densities. There's grey squirrels around at high density. Grey squirrels carry squirrelpox. So squirrelpox could potentially infect reds in these strongholds at the boundaries and spread into these strongholds. And that's what's happened. I was in Rothbury, which is up here near number 3, just at the weekend. And they've got these sorts of pictures on lampposts which are posters telling you to look out for reds with symptoms of squirrelpox. They want to know if reds get squirrelpox so they can try and act to do something about it quickly. And there have been squirrelpox outbreaks in some of these reserves, which leads to dramatic crashes in the populations. Some of the reds don't get infected, and the disease eventually dies out. And so then the populations can increase again, but it takes some time. So these strongholds protect reds, but they're vulnerable to potential outbreaks of squirrelpox. Now the situation in Scotland is a bit different. This is, as Steve said, where 80% of the red population still resides. The control effort has been fairly similar in Scotland. But the difference is, for most of the time, Scotland has been free from squirrelpox. It was just good fortune. The greys which were introduced in Scotland initially weren't infected or carriers of the disease, and there hasn't been disease in the grey populations because of that. Just good luck. So they haven't had to contend with squirrelpox here, but they've followed a similar strategy. 2004, the Red Squirrel strategy for Scotland designated strongholds in Forestry Commission areas. The other conservation groups like SNH and SWT designated strongholds in areas that weren't supported by the Forestry Commission, but they did one other key thing. They started monitoring and looking out for potential squirrelpox outbreaks in southern Scotland. They were aware that squirrelpox might spread through England into Scotland. And so they planned a strategy to try and act if that happened. And it was a good job they did, because in 2005 was the first squirrelpox outbreak in Scotland. It occurred just over the border from Canonby here, so in Scotland, just over the border there. By 2007, there's lots of outbreaks. You see these red dots here represent where squirrelpox has been detected. And the strategy was to control grey numbers wherever they detected squirrelpox, bring the density down to low levels, and they hoped that would prevent the spread of the disease. By 2012, they realised this wasn't really working. Again, the red dots here represent where squirrelpox outbreaks occur. So it spread into East Lothian, into the borders, into Ayrshire here, and into Dumfries and Galloway. So squirrelpox is still spreading despite considerable effort to try and prevent it spreading. And so it was just after this that Scottish Natural Heritage and Scottish Wildlife Trust got in touch with myself and with Peter Lurs to ask if we could do some modelling to try and explain how this squirrelpox was spreading. And so what they wanted to do was a modelling study which could assess what their control strategy had been doing in terms of preventing squirrelpox spread, and suggest other strategies that might be more effective. So that was in January. They wanted the results by August. That's not a very long time frame for doing a research project. So we had to think pretty quickly, and we kept our fingers well and truly crossed, and we had to hope we'd get some reasonable results, and we were, I think, lucky. So this is what we did. We realised that we would need a more realistic representation of the landscape, because the landscape was going to be important. And so we used digital land cover maps, which we got access to from Forestry Commission, to extract key squirrel habitats. So we extracted the broadleaf and coniferous forests in digital form. So we have a map of where those forests are. There's published data on how many squirrels can survive in different habitat types. So we used this published data to come up with potential densities for grey squirrels in red squirrels in Scotland. And I'm just focusing here on southern Scotland and a bit of central Scotland. This was a different independence result where England had just been removed from the map there. It's just not on the Forestry Commission Scotland data. That's why it's not really there. So we have potential densities for greys and reds. And we know where the distribution of greys and reds are. So we can overlay on to that where reds and greys actually are with these densities. And that gives us what's called initial conditions, ways that we can input some data into a mathematical model, and we can then see what happens. So that's going on in 1 kilometre squared grid squares. So that's some data, but within that we have to have a mathematical model as well. So this was the mathematical model. It's a slightly modified version of that model of competition and disease that I showed earlier. And the only difference really is it now runs on probability. So in each of those 1 kilometre grid squares, I know the number of red and the number of grey squirrels there are. I then essentially toss a coin. It's a many-sided coin, but you toss a coin, and that tells you an event that happens. And the event might be a birth, or it might be a death, or it might be a squirrel becomes infected. And by doing that, you can track the densities of healthy and infected red and grey squirrels within all of these 1 kilometre grid squares. So it's the sort of technique you can use to see how a disease might spread. And that's what we do. We use this modelling to see how disease might spread. And so that's what I want to talk about. So we set up the model, and in 2005, there was really no disease. We then introduced the disease somewhere around here, just over the border in Scotland near Canonby, and we see how it spreads. And this red and yellow colour here represents the intensity of the disease. And so what we see when we do one of our model runs is that the disease spreads quite quickly and spreads pretty rapidly throughout the whole of south of Scotland. But in this particular model run, it gets constrained in the south of Scotland. It doesn't spread beyond. And that's because there's a sort of string of fairly poor density habitat between the south of Scotland and central Scotland. And it acts as a bit of a buffer, which is difficult for the disease to spread across. Now, I said this is a probabilistic model, as in a model that runs on probability. So you run the model again, you get a different result, because you might get a different outcome when you toss your coin. And that's what we do. So in these sorts of models, you have to run the model lots and lots of time. And what you're interested in is finding out what different types of things can happen and what happens on average. They're the sorts of properties you're interested in. And 50% of the time this happened. The disease got stuck in the south of Scotland, which means 50% of the time something else happened. So this is the something else that can happen. So sometimes it generally starts in a similar way with the disease spreading through the south of Scotland, but then occasionally a chance event allows the disease to breach that poor habitat gap and get into central Scotland. And when it gets in there, it spreads really quickly through central Scotland because that's a nice, good habitat with high density grey squirrels. And so here it managed to spread through a little pinch point, as I call it, in northeast Ayrshire. So there's one pinch point where it might get through occasionally. There's other pinch points. Here's one in the Scottish borders where it managed to spread through into Mid Lothian. Once it gets into central Scotland, it spreads very quickly. And here's another pinch point that goes through East Lothian. Once it gets in there, it spreads quickly. And this is the average behaviour that I was talking about. So this map shows the average behaviour. It now shows the chance of disease being in a particular area. And so there is a 50% chance that the disease might get into central Scotland. So that's what happens if we run this model. But in this model, we're not applying the control which they are doing in the real world. But luckily, because we're working with the conservation agencies, they can tell us the level of control, and they can tell us where they're controlling, and then we can use that and we can input that into the model as well and see what happens. And so what happened? Well, this is the average results again. It's had some effect. It's actually slowed down the spread a little bit through the south of Scotland, and there's now only a 30% chance that disease will get into central Scotland. So the disease may still travel into central Scotland, and that's something we really want to avoid, because once it gets there, it starts moving further north to where the remaining red populations are. So it's had some effect, but it hasn't really stopped disease spread as we'd hoped. So is there a better way? Well, we saw that the disease spread through pinch points, and I highlighted these 3 pinch points here. So what if we control at those pinch points? Well, I did that in the first place, and when you do that, just like when you've got a bucket with holes in it, and you block up the main holes, then you find out where the other holes are. And by doing that, we found there was actually another pinch point here, which was important. So if we control at these pinch points, what happens? Well, we have to control at very high levels, about twice as high as the current amount of control they're applying in southern Scotland. But if we do it, we actually can be successful. It actually works 100% of the time. Now, you're going to say that's not true because this here is yellow. And I understand that that means that the disease has spread to central Scotland there. But we only applied this control from 2014 onwards to represent something they could do now and into the future. And what happened is, in one of the runs, the disease managed to get through and breach a pinch point before control was applied. And it strikes me that's a key message, that's a key result to keep in. You know, this could be effective, but you need to act pretty quickly because you're in danger of the disease breaching into central Scotland already. And once that happens, it's pointless controlling at pinch points because it's already got beyond them. So that was the result. That's what we took to the Squirrel meeting in August, and it was discussed seriously as a policy option. The problem was by then, we had several bits of new information. One bit is that funding isn't always as much as you'd like, and if anything, there was going to be less funding in future, not more, and this was asking for a sort of doubling in the effort required. But possibly even more crucially, by then there was new data on Squirrelpok's occurrence, and you can see it's already breached these pinch points. It already had got into central Scotland. Now, they're not convinced that it is possible you can control there and remove it. They're not convinced that the battle has been lost, but it certainly questions whether applying this extra effort at pinch points may be effective. And this is where we are now. This is the current situation, the best knowledge we have. So it's still actively being debated whether they can rid central Scotland of squirrelpox and therefore whether they can prevent it getting there by trying to apply a controlled effort at key locations. That's up for debate as we speak. But the other thing that they've realised is you can't potentially continue to control grey squirrels into the future forevermore. There has to be a viable option where we can maintain reds but reduce the effort. You can't always pump further and further funds in. There has to be a sensible solution in the long term. And that's what they're after now. They're after a long-term goal which optimises the effort required. Essentially, that means minimise the effort required to maintain reds in suitable strongholds and natural territories where they won't need too much intervention or control. And so I'm going to finish by talking about the strategies that are being used to do that, and where mathematical models are being used to help sort of shape these strategies. So one bit of work we're involved with is to try and manage red squirrel strongholds where they're relatively isolated. So here's an example of one. Here's me and Hannah and Peter and some others, no, Peter took the photo there, in Kidland, which is in Kielder. It's this region 2 and 3 here. This is the Kidland Forest and this is the Usway Ford Forest. It's literally in the middle of nowhere. Okay, it's forest surrounded by the Cheviot Hills on one side. It's really remote. Not many people even bother to walk here, let alone squirrels trekking the sort of 10 or 20 kilometres over moorland to get there. It's remote. It's unlikely that greys will ever get there. It's unlikely that the disease will ever outbreak there. So these reds you would think are safe. But not quite, because this is a Forestry Commission land again. So the policy here is it's a commercial forest. That's its main purpose. And so they fell and replant trees regularly. When you cut down the trees, it takes 25 to 30 years for them to grow again to maturity and provide food for red squirrels. So you need a viable strategy of felling and replanting, which enables reds to survive in these forests. So Forestry Commission have supplied us with their planting strategy for the next 40 years. And we input that into the model and we see what's going to happen. And what was going to happen was that in about 2025, there was going to be low density of red squirrels both in Kidland and Usway Ford simultaneously. They were very much at risk of extinction, and in the model we got extinction there about 40% of the time. So we showed them this, so they've now gone away, and they've redesigned their strategy to try and make the populations a bit less synchronous in the two forests, and they're also going to plant a nice tree corridor between the two forests. So when one forest is good and the other isn't so good, there's a nice connection to allow squirrels to move between them, to access the suitable habitat. And it was about 10 days ago we got the data back. And we're currently working on trying to do the modelling again to see if that's been an improvement. And then we're going to go back down and talk to Forestry Commission about that. So that's one place where we're using models to help look at current strategies. Another is in the other sorts of strongholds where they do have greys all the way around them. So here's a nice example of that. And we're just starting to do some work with the Red Squirrel Trust in Wales looking at Anglesey. So for those who don't know, this is Wales, okay? And this here is Anglesey. In 1997, there were only 40 red squirrels in Anglesey. They then removed the greys, and there's now 700 red squirrels in Anglesey. So much so that they are coming across this beautifully designed red squirrel corridor, which is the Britannia Bridge between Anglesey and the mainland in Wales, and they're starting to be red squirrels seen here near Bangor in Gwynedd. So reds are coming across. So the next stage is to try and remove greys here from the mainland. That acts as a buffer to prevent greys getting back onto Anglesey, but it might also act as a buffer to prevent the disease outbreak getting onto Anglesey as well. And so that's what we're doing now with models. They're going to remove the greys here, and then they want to know where do they control to stop greys getting back into this region. It's called painting the town red because we're hoping to paint Bangor and the surrounding area red with red squirrels. Thankfully, the Snowdonia Mountains go most of the way round, and that's not great for squirrels to cross. So we're hoping to find regions here where we can optimise control. And that eventually could maybe be done by local voluntary groups, so it doesn't really require a long-term financial effort. And as well as that, the models can say what will happen if you get a disease outbreak there. So it will give a strategy for what to do should the disease get to these regions. Okay, so that's another project that we're currently looking at. And all of these feed into what is the great big picture. And the great big picture is what's going to happen up here in Highland, Scotland. That's where most of the reds are. You don't have to do any control there because there are no greys. But there's this interface here between reds and greys. It's been relatively stable for 40 years. We're not quite sure about where it is. It changes with habitat and with seed crops. It moves a bit naturally. But there's never been disease in this region. So a big question is what's going to happen should disease get there? And we've already seen disease is starting to outbreak in some of these regions. And so that's the next question we're going to answer. And actually was at a meeting with Scottish Natural Heritage and Scottish Wildlife Trust yesterday afternoon. And that's their primary objective at the moment. They want to know what's going to happen at this interface. And if something bad's going to happen, what they need to do to try and prevent greys from moving into these red territories. So that is literally where we are now with red squirrel conservation. So that's how models can be used to look at a particular topic. But of course, they can be used for lots of other reasons, other things as well. And so the same techniques can be used to look at other systems. And so I'm going to very, very briefly finish and have a very tenuous link in my last slide, and you'll get it in a minute, about how the same modelling we do here can be used to look at other invasive systems and other disease systems where disease spread is important. And so here it is. These are two projects that haven't started yet, but I'm hoping will. And so one of them is to look at the dispersal of grey squirrels this time in the Okanagan Valley in Canada. Okay, so greys were introduced there just like they were introduced to England. So that's one project. How are greys dispersing down this corridor? Another one is to look at how bovine tuberculosis, which you might have heard of, is spread in badgers, in the badger cull, which is trying to prevent the spread from badgers to livestock. Well, in areas in Spain, wild boar have bovine TB and can spread it to livestock. So we're just starting a project just south of Madrid, trying to investigate how control of wild boar and a vaccine may prevent the spread of bovine TB in wild boar. Now here's the tenuous link. The Okanagan Valley is possibly the best wine growing region in Canada. The La Mancha area here in Spain is reportedly the largest wine growing region in the whole world. Now I'm a big lover of wine, and so both of these projects look very exciting to me. But it also seemed like a reminder that if I now stop talking, we can all go and enjoy a glass of wine. So thank you very much.